Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 122. Love, Safety, and Other Foreign Concepts. Shota was never happy to hear his morning alarm go off. But after last night and what felt like a sparse few minutes of sleep, he could pretty confidently say he was far less enthused than usual. He heard Zashi groan next to him. They probably hadn't gotten much sleep either. Reluctantly, he got up, silenced the alarm, and sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing sleep out of his eyes. He was still sat there, looking off into nothing, when Zashi got back from brushing his teeth. "Sho?" they called out gently. He looked at them slowly and sighed. "Yeah." He looked like he wanted to ask if he was all right, but thought better of it. Of course he wasn't all right. How could he be? Ivy was a child. They were 12. For heaven's sake, they were only 12. "I'm going to go make some coffee. Why don't you brush your teeth and freshen up a bit? Your hair is, well, it's interesting at the moment. Let's say that." They poked with a teasing smile. He did as he was told, but didn't bother trying to deal with his hair right now. He just put it up because he couldn't stand to look in the mirror long enough to make himself look presentable. He was supposed to be getting ready for work, but there wasn't a chance in hell that he was going today. None of them were. This situation was too screwed up for words to describe, and it took precedence above all else. He needed to come up with a plan. He needed to make sure that Midoriya didn't get caught for anything he did as Ivy. He needed to protect him, but he couldn't do it alone. Hizashi would help. He knew they would, but they weren't in a better position to do anything anyway. He needed to make sure nothing could ever be traced back to Midoriya, and he needed to have Ivy's case resolved so that no one ever went poking around in it again. He knew the two people perfect for the job. He just had to hope that they'd agree to it. For now, he needed to explain the situation in as little detail as possible to Nedzu so that he could buy time to come up with a plan. This kid was going to be cared for properly, and he was going to be a hero like he dreamed of, even if it was the last thing Shota did. He wouldn't fail him. Not again. Hizashi went about the kitchen making coffee as quietly as they could so as to not wake Midoriya. Should he even be sleeping? Honestly, should he even still be here? They wouldn't have been surprised if the kid had made a break for it last night, but it almost certainly would have woken Sho, and his shoes were still here, so they remained cautiously optimistic. Shota didn't seem too worried about that possibility last night, and as one of the most casually paranoid people they knew, if Sho wasn't worried about it, they figured they shouldn't be either. When Shota finally came out of the bedroom, his coffee had been sitting at the table a little longer than he would have probably preferred it. He didn't seem to care much about having his brew at the perfect temperature this morning, though, seeing as he picked it up and downed half of it in one go. "I told Nedzu I found Midoriya last night, and that none of us will be at school today. He's giving me until 6 p.m. to explain myself," Shota said as he sat down heavily at the dining table with his mug. "That's generous," they replied, both genuinely thankful and amused that Nedzu trusted them enough to give them 12 hours to cover up an untold number of crimes. "Well, it took some negotiation. I'd rather not get into it," he replied, looking off into the middle distance. Hizashi almost laughed at the absurdity of the situation, but they bit their tongue. Now wasn't the time. "He's still here, or at least his shoes are. He's not going to run. He's got nowhere to go. That city is his life, and UA is his future. If he was going to run, he would have done it before we got on the train," Shota insisted. He looked so tired. There wasn't a damn thing they could do about it, save perhaps making him another cup of coffee, but that was a band-aid on a bullet wound at best. "Do you think you should go check on him?" they asked. He seemed to be doing his best to nurse the remaining half of his coffee, but was doing a piss poor job of it. There was maybe a quarter cup left at this point. Yeah, he replied eventually. Hizashi held his hand out for his mug and nodded his head in the direction of the guest room, silently prompting Shota to get up and promising him another cup of coffee when he got back. He scrubbed his hand over his stubble and sighed before relenting. When Shota walked in the room, Midoriya, was sat on the far side of the room, smushed between their two desks, curled in on himself and clutching a throw blanket. He was looking blankly off into the distance and subtly shaking. Kid, Shota asked cautiously. He didn't respond. He didn't even look at him. There was no acknowledgement whatsoever aside from the slight tensing of his shoulders. Midoriya? He tried again. Nothing. He walked a few steps into the room, and that garnered a reaction. He didn't even make it past the foot of the bed, but Midoriya flinched and curled in on himself impossibly tighter. Hey, kid, it's okay. It's just me. He tried to soothe, but it didn't do any good. Slowly, he lifted up a hand, palm out, to show he meant no harm, but Midoriya flinched even harder at that and hid his head between his knees, covering himself with trembling hands. Okay, clearly he wasn't helping the situation. He stepped all the way back to the door slowly and audibly before he spoke again. Midoriya, it's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. No one's going to hurt you. He called over to him. He didn't react at all. He's not sure if he didn't believe him or just didn't hear him through his own racing thoughts. Either way, it was clear that Shota's presence wasn't helping. I'm going to leave. I'll shut the door. We'll both be out here if you need anything, he offered before he left slowly and shut the door gently behind himself. He paused on the other side of the door after he let go of his grip on the handle and tried to regain his composure. He felt his heart break in a million different ways for the second time in the last 6 hours. He was so scared. God, he was so scared. He'd never seen Ivy or Midoriya look that scared, and he was scared of him. Zashi must have heard the door shut because they came peeking around the corner looking for him. He must have looked a wreck because as soon as they caught sight of him, they sped over and started guiding him away from the room. They didn't speak until they'd gotten them both into the living room, away from the guest room's earshot. What happened? Is he okay? They asked, trying their best to not sound panicked and failing epically. Well, no, he's terrified, and I can't get near him. I don't know if he even heard a word that I said, he finally admitted. Zashi herded him toward the couch and sat him down before taking their spot next to him. He barely responded to me. I only knew he knew I was there because I saw him tense up. But when I walked into the room, he completely caved in on himself. He held his arms up to cover his head like I was going to run over there and kick him. He continued. Zashi took a moment to scrub his hand over his face and take it all in. He sat there thinking for a while before he looked back up at him. He looked like he wanted to say something, but didn't know if he should or not. What, Zashi? They pursed their lips and glanced away for a second before answering. Do you think he'd take it better if I went in? He was equal parts offended and understanding. Zashi wasn't as big a part of this mess, but at the same time, Midoriya should trust him. They'd been working together for years. He should trust him. He must have made a sour face because Hizashi grabbed his hand and gently stroked a thumb across his knuckles. I didn't mean it like that. It's just, well, you're just scary, Sho. He shot them a look for that. Don't give me that look. You know you are. You do it on purpose. You scare the shit out of those kids every day, and Ivy is very familiar with how brutal you can be, even more than the rest of your students. But he's never seen me so much as annoyed, unless he's watched news clips of me in a fight. He's panicking, and most of the interactions he's had with you revolve around violence of some sort, whether it was directed at him or not. I don't think that correlation is helping him right now, but that's not your fault, they explained as they gave him a sympathetic look. It made sense. Shota knew it made sense, but the look of fear on the kid's face was sickening. The thought that Midoriya, the thought that Midoriya could be so afraid of him made his stomach churn. Yeah, okay. Yeah, just let's give him a minute. He finally conceded. Zashi pulled him into a hug, planted a kiss on the top of his head, and just sat there with him in their arms until they deemed it had to have been long enough for Midoriya to have calmed down. When Hizashi knocked and opened the door, he was still somewhat taken aback to see Midoriya there. Obviously, Midoriya was there. He knew that. He had just spent last night holding his husband and crying because Ivy was Midoriya, and he was left alone far too young. Apparently, the memo didn't fully make it to his brain until he saw him with his own two eyes, because he stood shocked in the doorway for a split second before he composed himself. The kid was sitting in the small alcove between their desks on the far side of the room, with the throw blanket from the foot of the bed wrapped around him. The bed had not been otherwise disturbed. He clearly hadn't slept. His expression was blank and distant, but he still glanced up when they walked in. "Hey, kiddo," they greeted quietly as they made their way into the room. The kid before them looked nothing like the Midoriya they were used to. The bags under his eyes made them wonder if he had fully washed off his eyeshadow, and his gaze was dull. It didn't hold any of his usual wonder or excitement. All that was left was fear. He was terrified, and it showed in every line of his body. Hizashi shot him a sad smile and sat down with their back against the pull-out bed several feet away from the kid. He tried to back even further away, but he was already pressed up against the wall, so Hizashi adopted the least threatening stance they could and gave him a moment. "I'm guessing you didn't sleep much," he said, gesturing over his shoulder to the bed. Midoriya didn't respond. He just looked at them. But from what Sho had said, this already seemed to be going better than his encounter. "Do you think you could eat some breakfast? We don't have much. We have to go to the store. But we've got some miso from yesterday we were planning to reheat," he offered. The kid jerkily shook his head at that. A response? A response was good. This was progress. "Okay, we can wait a little while, but you'll need to eat eventually," they conceded. They sat in silence for a while, and Midoriya's gaze drifted back down to the floor. He wasn't looking at Hizashi, but they could tell his focus was on them, like he was still scared that he was going to hurt him. "What you thinking about, kid?" they asked after a while. Again, Midoriya looked up, but didn't say anything. His expression didn't change at all. He didn't even move like he was about to speak, but he looked like his hands were fidgeting in the folds of his blanket. "Is it hard to talk right now?" they asked. His brow furrowed at that, and he gave a shaky nod. "That's okay. That's normal. It happens to me all the time. Sometimes it's just so much that you can't force the words out, right?" He nodded again. This poor kid. Selective mutism wasn't really normal. Well, it was as a trauma response or as part of a disorder, but it wasn't normal. They couldn't even imagine what this kid had been through. They themselves had only gotten like that because for the first 12 to 13 years of their life, every time they opened their mouth, when they were upset, they ended up losing control of their quirk and hurting someone or breaking something. Do you think you could sign? I know you don't know too much yet, but it's something, right? The kid sat there for a moment thinking before he wiggled his hands free of the blanket and signed, Yes. Great. Now, can you tell me what's on your mind? Too much. He signed back sloppily. They barked out a laugh at that. Yeah, that makes sense. Can you tell me what you're feeling, aside from too much, because I'm sure that response still applies. Midoriya looked like he wanted to answer, like he was really thinking, but after a long bout of silence, he still hadn't responded. You don't need to boil it all down to one thing, and it doesn't even have to be what you feel the most. Just one thing you feel. Anything, he prompted again. After another long pause, he hesitantly signed back, Afraid. He couldn't even look them in the eyes when he signed that, like he was afraid of the very fact that he was afraid. It broke Hizashi's heart all over again. That makes sense. This is a lot of change and a lot of unknowns. Can you tell me something more specific that you're afraid of? I don't know what's. He paused before finger spelling the rest going to happen. Hizashi nodded and slowly went through the way to properly sign the sentence in the future tense before he responded, Well, I don't know what's going to happen either. Not for sure. A lot of things are going to change, but they're going to change for the better. You're going to be taken care of. You're going to have a proper roof over your head, and you're not going to need to worry about where you're going to get food. You're going to have a home. But it's your choice where you want that to be. Midoriya looked more and more confused with each word they spoke, so they gave him a second to process. He opened his mouth like he wanted to speak a few times, but nothing more than jumbled noises and starts of sentences came out before he gave up and looked back down at the floor. They gave him another minute to think before they spoke again. What's the matter, kiddo? He turned his furrowed brow back up to them as they signed, My choice? Yeah, kiddo. You've got a few options. You're probably going to stay here for a while. But once we get things figured out, you can go into the foster system for a couple of years till you age out or get adopted. Or you could become a ward of UA or, well, Sho should probably be here for this, but we both have foster licenses, so if you wanted to stay here, you probably could. The kid was staring at him completely slack-jawed, and he was back to stuttering out nonsense syllables. After a moment of sputters, he gave up trying to verbalize again. I don't understand. What don't you understand? I lied for years. I broke the law. I don't. You're not mad? I'm not in Trouble. Why are. I don't understand. He signed as tears rose in his eyes. No, sweetheart, no. I'm not mad. We're not mad. You're not. What do you mean? He was furious. Midoriya interrupted frantically. Sho, no, baby, no, he's not mad at you. He's, yeah, you're right. He is furious. He signed the word as he spoke it, but not at you. He's mad about what happened to you. He's mad at himself that he didn't do something sooner, but he's not mad at you. You were doing what you thought you had to survive. We couldn't be mad at you for that. This wasn't your fault. You are just a kid. None of this was your fault. Midoriya had been unsteady since they set eyes on him, but now he was fully trembling as tears poured down his face and he forced his slack jaw shut. They slowly got up and grabbed a box of tissues from their desk and tried to hand it to him, but he had curled in on himself completely as his hands fidgeted in front of him. It took Hizashi a moment to realize he was signing the word sorry over and over again. Kiddo, no, you don't have anything to be sorry for. It's okay. Everything is going to be okay. They tried to soothe as they knelt down in front of him. He was sobbing through heaving breaths, almost inaudibly. If it weren't for the faint sniffles and the hitched breaths, Hizashi would have wondered if their hearing aids had died. He cried just as unobtrusively as Sho, and it took every bit of strength he had not to let his own tears fall at the sight. The kid couldn't be more tense and curled in on himself if he tried. He didn't have any idea what set him off. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know if touching him would make it better or worse. So they just had to sit there and try to talk him through it. I've got a box of tissues that I'm setting down to your left. And I'm going to sit right here in front of you. I need you to breathe with me, kid. Come on. In, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Out, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Eventually, the kid's breaths evened, and he stuck a hand out to grab a tissue and pull it back into the cocoon of blanket and limbs that he'd stuffed himself into. I'm going to bring you a glass of water, and I want you to do your best to drink the whole thing. Then I want you to get in bed and try to sleep, okay? The kid's puffy, tear-stained face peeked up at him with a furrowed brow again. School starts in a few hours, he pointed out. Hizashi huffed out a small chuckle at that. Kiddo, I don't think any of us are up for that today, he countered. Midoriya tensed up at that, and his newly steadied breath stopped entirely. I can't. You can't. They'll know. I can't. I don't, he signed hysterically, not getting out one thought before he interrupted himself with the next. Since his face wasn't buried in the blanket, Hizashi slowly reached their hands out to still his. Midoriya, it's okay. We already called out. It's okay. We just said that Sho found you last night, and we'll explain more when we know more. It's all right. No one needs to know anything yet. We'll figure it out. I know it's easier said than done, but you don't need to worry about that right now. Right now, you need to rest. It's been at least 24 hours since you last slept, hasn't it? He nodded with a shaking inhale. I thought so. I'm going to make you some tea. It always helps me calm down. Is that okay? Do you like tea? You don't have to. Midoriya finally forced himself to speak because Hizashi still had his hands loosely clasped in his own. I know I don't have to, but I could use a cup right now, too, so would you take one? He offered again. Midoriya bit his lip and didn't answer, but Hizashi took that as enough of a response. I'll bring you a cup. I'll be back in a minute, he said with a soft smile and left before Midoriya could argue. Shota was sitting slouched at the dining table, bouncing his leg incessantly and looking into his half-empty cup of coffee like it held the answers to the universe. When Hizashi rounded the corner, his head shot up, and he looked at them expectantly. They had left the office door open, so they signed to him. He thought you were mad at him, he explained with a frown. I'm not. Sho tried to sign back, but they interrupted him. I know, Sho. I told him that you're mad at the situation, not at him. He thought I would be mad too. But he didn't seem nearly as upset by the thought of that as he was about you being mad at him. He sighed with a huffed laugh. He went around the divider wall to start making the tea he promised before continuing the conversation over the counter once he'd set the kettle to boil. I don't know whether or not he believed me, but I told him you weren't mad. He's terrified about what's going to happen. He's worried about legal trouble and where he's going to end up. And he was worried about what we told the school. What did you tell him? The truth. I told him that he was going to stay here for a while until we get things figured out, and then he has a few choices: the foster system, becoming a ward of the school, or staying with us. He admitted, I know I probably should have waited for you to offer that, but it's fine, Zashi. He signed back, but it looked like he wanted to say more. Hizashi gave him a look that said to go on. Did he flinch away from you? Yeah, a little. They saw Sho's face fall at that. Baby, I don't think it was personal. I think it's just because you went in there first. You left him alone and proved we weren't going to hurt him. If not that, then he's only more afraid of you because he cares far more about your opinion of him than he does mine. We just need to give him some time. You know that. They tried to soothe. Shota just looked back down to his coffee, seemingly resigned to the fact that they were right. They hadn't seen him this distraught in years, and they felt this frantic need to just make it better. But they couldn't. It was like an itch they couldn't scratch. They took a deep breath as they started to steep 3 cups of tea. Sho probably wouldn't drink his, but it was worth a try. End of chapter.